How do you know yourself? How do you understand what your true self is versus the false self? How do you distinguish between those? I want to invite you to join me on a journey of exploring the self and how it relates to meaning and existence. So what we will do together is we will explore a few different things. First, I'll go into differentiating between understanding of the ego in the Western psychology and the understanding of the ego and self in Buddhist psychology, with reference to Mark Epstein. And then we'll go into saying something about the role of various forms of meditation that one can work with. And then we'll go into discussing different dimensions of narcissism as a common human psychological phenomena. And then lastly, I'll go into discussing the terms of ego ideal and ideal ego, false self, fake personality, and the shell, as well as the true self. So these are all terms that are good to know when you go on a journey of getting to know yourself, regardless of your religious, spiritual discipline or where you are at in your belief. We're here together to bloom beyond belief, to understand religion and spirituality through the lens of psychology. And I do think that the self here is important to contemplate on, to be able to open oneself up to the beyond, to God or whomever you might have a relationship with. Okay, so to begin, let's first differentiate, right, between the Western psychology and the outlook on the ego versus this more Eastern outlook on it, or actually not the Eastern, but more the Buddhist psychology outlook on the ego self. So the Western psychology and the ego, when you look at it that way, the ego is very central, right, to the Western psychology. In fact, a lot of the psychology that we tend to learn in going through clinical psychology is rooted in Freud's psychoanalysis that works with the ego. And the ego is seen as a mediator, all right, between the id, it's a concept, it means the instinctual drives in humans, and the superego, the internalized societal norms, maintaining coherence and balance so that we won't just act out our, instincts, but the superego is kind of like encapsulating us so that there will be coherence and balance there so that we are, personas walking around the world functioning, essentially. So the ego there is the mediator, is the one that communicates in a way in between the id and the superego. The ego constructs a sense of self, okay? So the self being like all the labels and all of the ways that you describe yourself, all the ways that you think of yourself and portray yourself, that is really what the ego does. It constructs a self that you think of as very real, right? And it also constructs identity, as in like who you are. And it also regulates emotions, it regulates drives and external demands too. And so this cohesive self, it provides oneself a sense of stability, a sense of self-esteem, or an ability, at least, to navigate the world. Okay, to navigate the world, to know how to get from A to B. That's essentially what it does. Western psychology is often very focused on strengthening the ego to resolve internal conflicts. Because if you have these internal conflicts, either the id or the superego is like tuned up too much or tuned down too much. And so one needs to work with the ego to find a sense of coherence again and increase self-esteem and improve psychological health and well-being. So that's the focus of working with the ego in Western psychology. The Buddhist psychology has a quite different approach to the ego and the self. If you've ever explored, the Buddhist approach to psychology, then you do know that it's fairly different. Because Buddhist psychology challenges the notion of this, cohesive self that the Western psychology tends to be so much about. And the Buddhist psychology emphasizes something called anatta. And anatta means the no self or non-self. And the self is then viewed, obviously, as fluid, as ever-changing, as a process, rather than a permanent entity. So it's something that's flexible, moldable, can change any moment at any time, and, not seeing oneself and taking it for granted as like real, but constantly being like evaluating, like, who am I? Like, what am I? And just sitting with that and not attaching oneself to these different labels that you have to think about yourself. And so it leaves a lot of room to reinvent oneself and have this what's called sunyata, this voidness is the room for seeds to take root and the room for potential to grow in oneself. And according to Epstein, the psychologist is called, the ego in Buddhism is not rejected outright, but it is deconstructed through practices like meditation, through practices like observing oneself through mindfulness, or through concentrative practices, which then reveals the ego as a mental construct rather than in reality. So you go from the mental kind of paradigm of just, or not paradigm, but the brain wave of what's called, alpha, theta, beta brain wave, I believe it is, in the everyday life, to go into alpha and theta, where you're slowing down and kind of going within and get more in touch with the deeper self. And so the goal is not to eliminate the ego then. That's not the point. That's what a lot of people tend to misinterpret or have a misconception about. But it is rather to recognize the impermanence of you, the impermanence of the ego, the impermanence of who you think you are, the impermanence of everything in life in general, and thus reduce attachment to it, and allowing for a deeper connection with the moment. That is what it is about. And I remember when I got on my spiritual journey, one of the first books that I read was The Power of Now. And that's Eckhart Tolle, and he's very much about the Buddhist approach to psychology. And I think that it brings a lot of that I've gone on autopilot in the world back to a sense of contemplation or meditation. Mark Epstein's perspective is that Epstein, he integrates these views. He integrates the views of therapy and meditation, and he suggests that both of those complement each other, and that they don't need to be practiced one over there and not together, but that they can coexist. And he thinks that therapy essentially stabilizes the ego. Meanwhile, meditation, on the other hand, deconstructs the ego, or challenges the solidity of the ego, and fosters what's called selflessness. And so this is where, in a way, you might say that if you're able to then combine these, you will surely eventually realize that there's truth to selflessness. There's love to be found in selflessness. There's something about that sacrifice there that you eventually realize is going to require you to sort of connect to the beyond. And that is where I guess I found Christ, and Christ unites these two in an interesting way. But anyhow, Mark Epstein's perspective, just an example to make this real. Epstein, he notes that while meditation can help individuals confront narcissistic traits, I do think that he thought that unresolved psychological issues may resurface during meditation, requiring therapeutic intervention to process them effectively. So what he's getting at there is that when you're meditating, you get in touch with a lot of unconscious, biases, unconscious belief systems, unconscious this and that, and or you go about your life and you recognize triggers and you are mindful about those triggers. And so he thinks that that's where psychotherapy comes in, to be able to intervene there in the mindfulness, in the concentration practice, that at some point you'll have to integrate or kind of, have that psychoanalytic point of view on these things to be able to integrate them. So the key difference here, if you really think about it, is that Western psychology focuses on building and strengthening the ego. And Buddhist psychology emphasizes transcending the ego by recognizing its illusory nature, that it's sort of like an illusion. And Epstein bridges these approaches, and he's advocating for a balance between ego stability and selflessness. So you need to have a sense of framework, a sense of cohesiveness, and the incohesiveness existing within the cohesiveness. the circle within the square. If there's just a circle on its own or just a square on its own, it doesn't produce psychological well-being. It doesn't produce a meaningful life even. These things go hand in hand. So that's that section. The second section I want to get into is saying something about the role of the different forms of meditation to be working with. So in this realm of meditations, there's typically two that are, let's say, mostly practiced, and that's concentration meditation and it's mindfulness insight meditation. And so the concentration meditation, it makes sense that is about focusing your attention. And in this day and age, with so many distractions and so much pulling on our attention, obviously there's a time and a place to be practicing concentrative meditation that can really assist you from developing all these different ADHD tendencies, because there's just constant noise. So this concentration meditation, what really can help there, and I'm going to look at it through different religious disciplines or spiritual disciplines. For instance, I have practiced concentrating on a single item by keeping my eyes open-eyed meditation. Could be something like looking and gazing at a fire, gazing at a candle. It could be gazing at a sunset, gazing at a tree, something external. That helps a lot for those who find themselves, ascending a lot and just like living in this spiritual haven or this existence beyond. If you're drawn to that a lot, then it helps to ground you, to be concentrating on something in and around you in the external, to keep you grounded and rooted and realize that you're here. Meanwhile, you could also practice concentration practice by focusing on your breath. Like that's also an object, the breath, focusing on the inhale and out, exhale. And then also you could focus on a mantra. That's typically what they'd say in New Age. Find yourself a mantra. I practice now, in the Christian walk, I can contemplate and focus on a verse. I can meditate and concentrate on a verse and let the meaning just like soak into my soul. And that's another way. So what does this do? It develops tranquility and it develops a sense of stability, okay? It also could help alleviate anxiety, it could calm the mind, and it creates a foundation for deeper introspection. So this is a great foundation for the other kind of meditation that I'm getting to. And it also provides a temporary sense of unity. You can even like literally find yourself getting united in a way to the candle, to the fireplace, to the sunset. You'll find yourself It's like in a bubble. And it counteracts feelings of fragmentation, which is why it's so helpful for those who find themselves extremely anxious or, just stressed or overwhelmed by life or by the beyond even. Especially those who are advanced in contemplation through mindfulness, you could really get use of a concentration practice. So the mindfulness meditation then, what is that? Well, it encourages that you would be observing and mindful of your thoughts and your emotions and your sensations without attachment or judgment. Listen, we have so many senses, okay? We have the eyesight, we have what we hear, we have what we feel, we have the different senses that are extrasensory as well, such as like intuition and clear knowing and all of these. And these are different senses that can be overwhelmed by the amounts of data and information and just constant noise in and around us. And so mindfulness, what that does is that it brings you into a sense of coherence and observation of all of this information. It creates a gap between your instant thought and the response or the reaction that you have. That's the practice, to mindfully contemplate before you act, before you do, before you say something. And it reveals the impermanent and empty nature of the self, the anatta. So it fosters detachment from ego-driven concerns, and that's really useful because sometimes our ego tends to take over. And let's say even if you're dating or in a relationship or something like that, even in friendships, sometimes you might want to catch before doing and saying something because it can be destructive or detrimental to the relationship overall. And thus, mindfulness will enable you to have a more constructive interaction, a more constructive response, a more constructive relationship that can bring you back to center, that can bring you back to the sense of no self, or the sense of being of service, okay? Being of service rather than focusing on the self and what I can get out of you. Do you know what I mean? An example here would be practitioners that experience terror as they confront the dissolution of the self, followed by delight when they release attachments. So what is that all about? I think it's about, if you're practicing mindfulness, sometimes you might be confronted by terror, confronted by like, whoa, I'm recognizing a dissolution here of the labels that I've put on myself, and that can be quite emotional or quite like confronting. And then thus, if you stay in that, there can eventually come a sense of delight and a peace with knowing that, oh, maybe that label isn't true. And I think, in scripture it talks about taking every thought captive, And that is what mindfulness does. It invites you to do that. So how can meditation of these kinds transform narcissism? I would say that meditation can restructure narcissistic traits by balancing concentration, as in like the stability, and insight, as in the deconstruction of self. So it confronts and restructures narcissistic traits, which both are necessary here. And so it helps you to then recognize and let go of the ideal ego, the static perfection, this ideal perception of what you could be or what something could be like. It invites you to let go of that, and the ego ideal, the aspiration self-image, you also let go of. reducing then self-importance and fostering authenticity. So you have here again the ideal ego, which is the static perfection, and then you have the ego ideal, the aspirational self-image. So actually, the ego ideal is what you're aspiring to versus ideal ego is the static perfection. You see what I mean? Those are quite different. And so what are the risks and balances here for meditation? This is so important. Excessive focus on concentration practice can actually reinforce the ego, while an overemphasis on insight practices through mindfulness, if you're constantly meditating and mindful all the time on insight, that can lead to feelings of emptiness or anxiety because you're not grounding, you're not here, you're not exercising your insights into action, into service, into creativity. So these need to go hand in hand. So a balanced approach is essential for psychological and mental well-being and growth. There is a therapeutic role here, right? Meditation really complements therapy by providing a direct, experiential way to address deep-rooted psychological conflicts, enhancing self-awareness and emotional regulation. So you can tell that meditation has its place, psychotherapy has its place, and they can go hand in hand, and that's so crucial to be able to have a functional ego. I'm also now going to touch on narcissism a little bit more and look at the different dimensions of that as actually being a common human psychological phenomena. So there's a certain development of narcissism. In this day and age, we tend to think of narcissism. When we say narcissism, we just think of the narcissistic, dysfunctional form of narcissism. We think narcissists that have a disorder of some kind, right? But the thing is that narcissism is developed in every single human being. Every single one of us have this. And in a way, you can think of it from a biblical perspective as, sin coming into the world, and sin being, kind of self-absorbed in a way. So narcissism originates in early childhood. And this is where the infant, when you're born, you have an undifferentiated self. You're not a self, like your consciousness is not developed as self yet. And so what you then end up doing as an infant is that you get united to the caregiver, and this fosters a sense of self-perfection. You perceive yourself as perfect and as, oh, I get my needs whenever I want them kind of thing, because that is what you need to survive. And your caregivers are there to be there for you, to support you through that season. But that fosters ideals of self-perfection. So this stage creates a lingering desire to return to that state of what's called omnipotence, meaning being omnipotent, being everywhere all at once, being met, that one's demands are met when I want them to be met. There's this sense of, I want it now. I need it now. If I can't have it now, I'm going to do and feel X, Y, and Z, right? And so that influences human aspirations and relationships. So how can we discern between these different dimensions of narcissism? You have the healthy narcissism, you have the grandiose narcissism, and you have in the middle the vulnerable narcissism. So the grandiose narcissism, is inflated self-importance. And this is stemming from deep insecurity and compensatory defenses. And an example here would be, for instance, a person who portrays themselves as it all together and portrays confidence, but is actually deep down deeply vulnerable or feels deeply vulnerable at some level. And there's compassion there for you if you have this. That's actually what you need to develop in giving oneself, to be able to meet that vulnerability there and not lean into this overconfident persona. It actually can be quite dysfunctional in relationships. So the other form of narcissism would be vulnerable narcissism. And this involves actually hypersensitivity to criticism and a low self-esteem. And often this is masked by defensive withdrawal. So you then actually you get extremely vulnerable to what people say about you, say to you. You're kind of entitled, you feel entitlement, and you're like, how dare someone say such thing about me, poor me, kind of thing. And the typical reaction to that is that you just leave, you just go, you just want to be by yourself. You close the door, you shut the door, and you go. Or you don't do that physically, but you internally create a wall. You block it off, you shut down, you're unreachable. You withdraw your presence and you're not available, you're unavailable. So what is then the healthy narcissism? Healthy narcissism is a balanced sense of self-worth and confidence. And this is where you are able to say, say that you are worthy and know that you are confident, but you're not overly confident, you're not overly anything at all. You're enabling yourself to engage authentically with others, and you have room for other people to exist around you. You have room for other points of view. You have room for different ways of engaging. You are not projecting yourself onto others in a way that you're like pushing and forcing anyone and everyone to be acting in accordance to your whims, your always. So the meditative perspective here on narcissism is that meditation actually confronts both grandiosity and vulnerability by exposing the illusions underlying self-perception. So it can be really beneficial to meditate because it dismantles the ideal ego, the static perfection, and it challenges the ego ideal. It challenges the aspirational goals that you might have for yourself, that you think, I am going to do this. If I don't do that, if I'm not achieving this thing, then I must be extremely worthless, right? So when you meditate, you just contemplate on these things and you're able to observe yourself and the labels and the aspirations from a different point of challenging them. And this can then foster humility, foster selflessness. And the thing is that if you're not meditating on it, reality will meet you face to face one day and you will be humbled. Whether you want it or not, life will humble you, to sculpt you, to shape you, to prune off the excessive narcissism, whether it's vulnerable narcissism or it's, the grandiose narcissism. The therapeutic implications of this is that narcissism can obviously persist throughout life. It can, though, through meditation and therapy, provide you with tools to address the manifestations that it has in your life. And therapy focuses on understanding and integrating traits rather than ignoring them. And the meditation fosters detachment and self-transcendence. Okay? So I just want to sum that up. Therapy focuses on understanding and integrating narcissistic traits, while meditation fosters detachment from the narcissistic traits and self-transcendence of blooming beyond the self to connect with something and someone deeper, the essence from which you can be kinder, more humble human being in general. Lastly, I'm going to be discussing the terms of ego ideal, discuss false self, fake personality, the shell, and the true self. So join me. Ego ideal. I've already touched upon it a little bit, but the ego ideal, it represents an aspirational self-image. You might have an aspiration right now. What's your aspirations in life? We all have them to some degree, one way or another, and they are often rooted in childhood narcissism and societal expectations if they're not, evaluated through a lens, a different lens, and deeply contemplated on, So the ego ideal is usually that. It's like, I grew up and everyone told me that I'm good at X, Y, and Z, so I'm just gonna do that, Or in your childhood, someone were like, you should be this will earn you a lot of money, and so you should just study that and become that will make you happy, and you do that. And you live by this ego ideal, and you make decisions from the ego ideal, where you then go down paths that might not be rooted in essence, but rooted in societal expectations, family expectations, and all of these things. An example could be also that a person strives to meet an idealized version of themselves to gain approval or admiration. It could even be such a thing as like doing excessive sport, doing excessive beauty rituals, doing excessive performance in school just to be worthy, just to be approved, just to do well. And what can meditation here do? Well, meditation, it helps deconstruct the ego ideal. Like I've said, deconstruct the ego ideal and revealing its impermanence and aligning aspirations with authentic values. The false self is a term that's coined by Winnicott, and he talks about it being a defensive facade developed to meet external demands, masking the true self. So this is not the true self, this is the false, and it's kind of dry, empty. It's causing you to not be fully in touch with that deeper essence, the beyond. And an example here would be if you are suppressing your genuine emotions, example, to conform to societal norms. So if you feel a certain way, you just like suppress and it's not coming through. For instance, if you're in a relationship and you have certain emotions come up that you don't know how to communicate, instead you're kind of like putting them aside, just being like, no, that's not valid to feel. I'm not going to communicate these things. It's way too early in the connection. It's way too late. Like, it's not the good time to talk about this. And it's like, we want to explore those emotions. So recognizing and dismantling the false self is essential for authentic self-expression and fulfillment overall. There's nothing good that comes out of not expressing oneself, at different times, especially in relationships, because it fosters weeds in yourself and also in the relationship overall. Then there is this concept of the fake personality, or the shell, it's also called. So this would be a superficial identity that's formed to navigate your life, often again rooted in childhood experiences and also of reject or of neglect. And the shell, you can think of it as like, how can I say it? As having a lot of coats on you that is not you. How many coats do you need to take off before you're like, you can say, my true self? The true self, the way I view it now, is being a child of God, being a child of the Creator, being a child of just pure love in your uniqueness, okay? And so this kind of shell, it hides the essence of who you truly are, leading to feelings of emptiness and insignificance. And so confronting this chasm, the way he describes it, the way Almost describes it, of emptiness beneath the shell, is necessary to self-realize and transform, to confront the chasm between the shell and the essence, being and living in that for a bit. Both Winnicott and Olmos talks about true self, and the true self represents the authentic core of an individual that's free from societal expectations, conditioning, and defensive constructs. And it emerges when you relinquish the false self and aligns yourself with your intrinsic essence. The way that I view it through the Christian lens is that the essence is in fact the Holy Spirit in a way. Like it's Jesus. It's like the Christ living in you, and that's the essence. That's like what everyone actually has in common. And whether you call it Christ or not, it's irrelevant. It means that you're love. Like look at what Christ represents. It's love, it's kindness, it's patience, it's all these things. And almost describes the true self as an undefined presence. Experience as grace, that's God, unity, that's God, and intrinsic value, that is also God. That is the true self that you then get in touch with and speak from and act from. And what could then be the practical implication of like looking at these different terms? Well, and looking at how therapy and meditation works here with these terms. Therapy and meditation, they both aid in transitioning from a false self to a true self, from ego-driven self to your essence. It's like peeling off the layers of the onion in a way, and recognizing that even with an onion, like eventually you'll get to the essence, you won't have to peel no more. Do you know what I mean? I remember in New Age, like I kept wanting to heal, but it's like eventually you'll get in the circle because there's no more layers to really peel off because you're in that, you've found the essence, and there's peace there, there's love there, there's everlasting like just room and light. And so with all of this being said, as we now conclude here our exploration of meaning, existence, and the self, I really encourage you to consider this. What does it mean to you to understand your true self? What relationship do you have to yourself? How can this understanding of the true self influence your search for meaning? Do you find yourself in touch with a false self right now? Are you driven excessively by grandiose narcissism or by vulnerable narcissism, or are you living from a place of healthy narcissism? Do you find yourself speaking, acting, thinking from a place of essence and truth, or from a place of constant judgment, criticism, and all of that? You see, in the garden community that you are welcome to join into, we contemplate on these different topics like meaning, self, and how psychology, religion, theology, spirituality can all highlight more about ourselves so that we can better serve in the world around us, be more available, and to really be able to bloom beyond, to transcend ourselves. And in order to do that, one has to go on this journey. You have to go on this journey of working with the ego. And we can do that, as I mentioned, through psychotherapy and meditation, and also through what I've already talked about a lot, through symbolism, contemplation on that, on just all the things, spirituality and religion, that it provides you with. And I think that meditation can really be a beautiful tool. Contemplation can be a beautiful tool in this journey. And I also think that to actualize the insights that you might have, it really helps to have someone ask you powerful questions on the daily, to be invited into community to share what it is that you are thinking about, as that can really assist you in having a more fulfilling psychological well-being. and life overall. So together we contemplate, connect, and contribute, and we gather, we grow, and we glorify the beyond as that becomes more and more apparent to us on our journeys. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for having been here, and I will link the garden below, so have a look at the garden and you're welcome to join in.